Hello, everybody. My name is Nathalie Gontier. Welcome to the 9th AppEEL webinar, which continues to be dedicated to the book launch of the Oxford Handbook of Human Symbolic Evolution that was edited by me, Andy Locke, and Chris Sinha. Chris is also here with me co-hosting this event, and Andy, who is in New Zealand, is unfortunately unable to participate in this afternoon session. Our first speaker is Luís Tirapicos, who is a very fine colleague of mine at the University of Lisbon, and he was also one of the main co-organizers of Protolang 6 that we held in 2019 in Lisbon. I cannot express my gratitude enough for that. And so Luís is also one of the authors, together with Pimenta and Fabio Silva, on a chapter on archaeoastronomy. And so he's going to be talking about that today. Luís, please.
Thank you, Natalie, for the invitation to take part of this wonderful volume. So the title of our chapter is Symbolism and Archaeoastronomy in Prehistory. The authors are Fabio Silva, Fernando Pimenta, and myself. We have collaborated, in my case and Fernando's, for about 2 decades now. So this is let's say the culmination of several years of learning and studying in this field. Well, this chapter explores the symbolic and conceptual relations between prehistoric groups and the sky. The study of how people engage with the sky is known as cultural astronomy, a term that comprises any field concerned with the sky and culture, including archaeoastronomy. Let me just for a moment.
I'm going to take the opportunity to ask the people that are not speaking to put yourself on mute, because there's some background noise.
Sorry for this interruption. Including archaeoastronomy. The latter focuses on analyzing the archaeological record for evidence of past skyscapes, past forms of engagement with the celestial objects, and how they would feature in the worldviews of the societies under study. The chapter discusses 6 case studies from the western part of the Iberian Peninsula that are representative of prehistoric contexts found in the other parts of the world. They illustrate how prehistoric skyscapes provided not only spatial access for the construction of structures that align to celestial objects and events, but more importantly, how such alignments served as temporal anchors more to key environmental, social, and symbolic moments of transition. Our main objective here is to present a brief summary of our chapter. In such a short time, we choose to discuss 2 of our 6 cases, hoping that unveiling part of the story could in some way raise your interest to read the whole chapter, the whole text. The sky is filled with entities: the sun, the moon, the planets, individual stars, asterisms, and constellations, the Milky Way, that are as much as part of the environment as a given society, as the land, trees, animals, birds, mountains, rivers, lakes, and the sea that surrounds them. The celestial objects can be conceived as animate beings with agency and social relations between themselves and the wider environment. According to our colleague Stanislav Ivanizevsky, in a work published in 2011, human societies often people their skies with supernaturals, ancestors or mythological heroes to whom they become related through family ties, mythological narratives, political alliances, or power relationships. The daily and seasonal disappearances and the reappearance of celestial objects might be linked symbolically or functionally with other cycles of the environment, and thereby form symbolic templates for processes of individual and social renewal and transformation, such as those played out in rites of passage or funerary rites, or provided the timing for religious and magical practices, feasts and massive gatherings, seasonal migratory activities, and key moments in the hunting, gathering, and agricultural yearly cycles. It therefore should not come as a surprise to find the celestial bodies intricately tied to the notions of time and even to the calendars of so many societies worldwide. Such skyscapes act not only as temporal anchors for society, but can also provide special axes, key moments in the transits of the celestial bodies through the skies can be seen to highlight cosmological directions that can act as navigational guides or become spatial templates to be replicated or targeted by the built environment. The study of how people engage with the sky is known as cultural astronomy. It is perhaps more appropriately conceived as an umbrella term that encapsulates any field concerned with sky and culture. It therefore subsumes under its span such fields as the history of astronomy, the history of astrology, ethnoastronomy, which focuses on the ethnographic record, and archaeoastronomy, which focuses on the archaeological record. As a field of academic inquiry, archaeoastronomy predates its younger siblings, its origins being lost in 19th century antiquarianism. However, it has traditionally had a specific focus on the orientations of monumental structures, in particular trying to identify intentional alignments to celestial objects. It reached popular status in the 1960s when claims that a vast number of solar and lunar alignments were intentionally built into the architecture of the prehistoric stone circle of Stonehenge in England, and generated a heated debate between archaeologists and archaeoastronomers. Ever since, and despite ebbs and flows, the field turned back on itself, rarely engaging with archaeologists and preferring to present and publish findings in their own conferences and proceedings volumes. As a reaction to this lack of cooperation and cross-field engagement between archaeologists and archaeoastronomers, the notion of skyscape archaeology has been recently introduced. And I should add that Fabio Silva, the first author of this chapter, has been one of the main advocates, or maybe the main advocate of this notion. This relocates the debate firmly within the wider discipline of archaeology by engaging with the wider archaeological record, both material and environmental, while embracing the anthropological concept of reflexivity as a methodological necessity to overcome modern assumptions of Eurocentric biases, and taking a less monolithic stance with regards to the theoretical framework that underpin research questions, data analysis, and subsequent interpretations. The concept of skyscape, therefore, emerged as an unbiased term to refer to a society's relationship to what we call the sky and the celestial bodies. The three dimensions of a skyscape mentioned in the beginning of the article, animism, timing, and direction, find materiality, and hence find themselves encoded in the material record in a number of ways. One such way, and the way that has been more popularized within archaeoastronomy, is that of structural orientations, as I have mentioned. The very word orientation betrays an emphasis on the East, which might relate to the medieval prescription to build churches so that the audience is facing East, the rising sun, and hence symbolically facing the risen Christ. This, however, seemed to be more symbolic prescription than functional instructions, as most churches' orientation deviate from East in yet to be fully understood ways. Nevertheless, some structures in either their symmetry or in the placement of unique architectural features do encode functional alignments to celestial objects as key moments in time. Famous prehistoric examples include the stone circle of Stonehenge with its axis aligning precisely with sunset and on December solstice, and Newgrange in Ireland, a passage grave that features a roof box above its entrance that permits the light of the rising sun to penetrate its otherwise dark chambers at the winter solstice. Many other examples of complex structures that encode celestial alignments can be found in a variety of cultures worldwide and across different time periods. Depending on the social cultural context, such structural alignments may have been built to produce unique experiences when observing celestial objects, to establish light-shadow interactions with the built and natural environments that may be conceived as hierophanies, or to animate what we would otherwise consider inert matter. The temporal anchoring that the celestial bodies provide can also find its way into the material record, also via structural orientations, as celestial bodies are often visible only periodically. They match the directions of buildings only at key moments in time when heaven and earth might be conceived as being in alignment. So skyscapes are not just good for thinking about time and space. They also offer a rich visual canvas, which often finds its way into iconography and art. Examples abound of prehistoric rock art with motifs that have been interpreted as representations of celestial objects, including constellations or even supernovas, of which motifs, with motifs, that are activated or perhaps animated through their interaction with sunlight. Many such cases have been the object of critique, mostly because of the projection of ethnocentric and anachronistic modern skyscapes onto non-modern peoples. Nevertheless, the impactful, utterly visual experience of the sky is undeniable, and it stands to reason that some iconographic motifs may indeed represent celestial bodies, even if those representations won't necessarily be immediately obvious to the non-anthropologist, as art is so often produced through a social cultural lens. Perhaps less tangible, the celestial bodies individually or as part of clusters are often mythologized, or perhaps myths and folktales are projected onto them. While not all the material, as often they are only transmitted orally, these stories frequently provide the explanation and justification for artistic representations, as well as for material artifacts. Talismans, protective symbols, and other icons might be related to a society's skyscape via some story, written or oral, legend, folktale, or myth that explains or connects the symbology of the artifact to the celestial object. These are patently harder to disentangle when only the material record is available. However, in some instances, at least, later written mythologies can provide keys that unlock a deeper understanding of such material objects and art. Of our 6 case studies, we select to discuss today in this section, number 2, the Alentejo megalithic open enclosures, and case study number 6, open hair rock art between the Alva and Seja rivers, which are depicted, or are represented here in this map of continental Portugal. Starting by case number 2, the Alentejo megalithic enclosures. Archaeologists believe that the establishment of Neolithic economies in central Alentejo may have occurred as early as 5,600 BCE. However, the first megalithic evidence in the region comprised of open enclosures only appears during the Middle Neolithic, that is in the 6th to the 5th millennia BCE, predating the communal 7 and 9 stone passage graves that later appear in the same area. The communities that built the enclosures may have been the outcome of a sedentarization process by the Mesolithic populations that previously had occupied the basin of the Tagus and Sado rivers, or the outcome of colonization by other groups that migrated into this area. So here we see plans of these enclosures. According to archaeologist Manuel Calado, the basic footprint of these enclosures is that of a horseshoe, whose opening is to the east. In most of these enclosures, the largest menhir is located within this horseshoe limit at one focus point of the enclosure. In addition, many of the menhirs feature decorations, with the most common motifs being crescents, circles, horseshoes, and croziers. According to Calado, the enclosures would have been conceived as anthropomorphized standing stones that surrounded the standing space with an opening to the east. Despite their complexity, the horseshoe shape of these enclosures provides a direction of interest given by that of a major axis of the horseshoe. A statistical analysis of the orientation of this major axis indicates a preference for orientation of the major axis of the enclosure, the axis of symmetry that bisects the horseshoe shape in its oriented, and is oriented towards its opening. And this direction is the rising position of the autumn full moon. The celestial event, this celestial event corresponds to the first full moon that rises to the north of the rising position of the sun on the same day. Frequently, this corresponds to the first full moon after the astronomical autumn equinox. Because these monuments were probably linked with the earliest stages of Neolithization in the region, their builders were likely to have had a mixed subsistence strategy involving hunting, gathering, pastoralism, and farming. It is therefore likely that they were seasonally nomadic. The megalithic enclosures could therefore have been primarily used for social and/or religious ceremonies that coincided with the autumn full moon, at the time of the return of these communities to the Alentejo area. Concerning case study number 6, in the area between the Alva and Ceira rivers in central North Portugal, over 900 engraved rock outcrops have been recorded. The petroglyphs were dated based on their style, from Paleolithic through the Bronze and Iron Ages up to modern times. The sites are situated along ridges which have for millennia been used as pathways for human and animal seasonal migrations. In this area, engraved outcrops tend to occur at higher altitudes, over 700 meters, dominating the landscape, with smaller slopes that provide a better accessibility. While the slope orientation in the area present a roughly uniform circular distribution, slopes where engraved outcrops are located present a south and southeast predominance. Or this predominance, or this pattern can be seen in this diagram. A study of 688 engraved outcrops in the area by Pimenta and colleagues revealed a significant interest in horizon markers in the directions that correspond to the extreme positions of the rising sun, the summer and winter solstices, the podomorphs depictions of the human feet. Engraved on these outcrops, however, also provide an orientation given by their symmetry, axis, as well as a walking direction when available. This cluster in a very narrow azimuth band that could not be explained by topographic motivations in such a wide area covering more than 2,500 square kilometers. With a seasonal summer occupation and an interest in the eastern horizon, the authors made the possible symbolic association with the rising of the summer full moon. However, other possible explanations are discussed in the full text of the chapter. Now, a brief concluding remark. Much like elsewhere in the world, prehistoric Portuguese communities in different regions and across broad time ranges incorporated connections to celestial objects in the natural and built environment they inhabit. These links, when they can be identified as a result of intentional activity, provide a point of entry into the highest rank of Christopher Hawkes' famous ladder of archaeological inference. That is to say, they open up research to the minds of prehistoric societies, or at the very least into those parts of their world or worlds that we call the sky and the celestial bodies. So I finish here, and I think we have maybe a few minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Luís. We indeed do have time for questions. So please, if you have questions, either put that in the chat or raise your virtual hand, and we will take it from there then. There is a question of Camila. Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Luís. Thank you. We often invite Fabio to come and talk to our group at UCL, RAG. But so we have some, we've been hearing from Fabio a lot about some of these monuments, so it's very interesting indeed. Yeah, just thinking about this rhythm of transhumance, and you mentioned with the second case study that the likely alignments on the autumn full moon would be like for the bringing down of animals, presumably from being away in the pastures. Now, we've sometimes thought about the possibility that, because what we talked about before lunch was, we didn't mention the moon, but the lunar cyclicity that is very much part of hunting cosmology, with a waxing and a waning phase. And Ian mentioned this full moon hunting kill with the dry season full moon as still significant even for the Hadza. So potentially that return on an autumn full moon kind of correlates in terms of the annual cycle in a way that the cycle of the hunting gathering would be a lunar one. They kind of shift onto an annual instead of a lunar, a monthly axis. But yeah,
it's one of several hypotheses we discuss in the chapter. In terms of astronomical phenomena that fits to this data, there are other possibilities. Even you can even think of conspicuous stars. But yes, it is true that the sun and the moon are the most conspicuous celestial bodies, and probably linked with symbolic, with human symbolic thinkings since very long time.
Yes.
So it's an hypothesis that we have to take into account very seriously. But there are other, in terms of simple analytical, astronomical, let's say, phenomena, there are other instances that fit the data. But of course, the sun and the moon seems to be if we use the Occam razor, maybe it's a reasonable choice.
Chris Knight also has a question.
Well, yes, it's sort of continuing a bit from that. In the beginning of your talk, you were sort of saying it's not surprising that humans have made these connections with constellations and celestial bodies and anthropomorphized them. But of course, from a Darwinian point of view, it's extremely surprising in the sense that we are great apes, and although it's possible that chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas and orangutans are sky watchers, and of course they have to take account of all sorts of different things, including nocturnal light and stuff. Surely they do, but I would perhaps ask you, wouldn't it be better to say it is very surprising, and then look for an explanation, because otherwise we're sort of already in culture. We know.
Sorry, I missed your last sentence. Sorry.
Well, sorry, I'm just saying. I just suggest you turn it round, perhaps, and say it's actually very surprising that humans do this. Because if you say it's very surprising, which I think it is actually, from a Darwinian point of view, at any rate, then it prompts you to look for an explanation. Whereas if you say it's not surprising, you're sort of assuming we're already in symbolic culture, and sort of once you're there, of course, all these things will happen. But I suppose I sort of felt, I don't know, like a sort of tweak there. No, it's very surprising. You need an explanation.
Thank you for your comment.
Okay.
More questions? Yes.
We also have Fernando Pimenta is also participating in this session. I don't know if Fernando wants to comment the question or add something.
I've just a small comment to the first question from Camila. What we observed in several cases in Portugal is that, in fact, in a lot of places, there seems to be still some transient movements in action on the Neolithic, which is probably still part of the hunter and gathering passage to the Neolithic culture. And we observed, in fact, a lot of transhumance movements. And in several cases, it seems that, in fact, for those movements, they are seasonal marks associated. And the moon has an important role in most of their cases. And we can speak about continuity, or we can speak about humans are humans and they observe the landscape, the skyscape, and they appropriate a part of their vision, and they appropriate the seasonal movements into their lives. So we can say it's surprising, or it is not surprising, but I think it's probably surprising because especially when we look for other parts of the world that were probably not connected at that moment, and we see that similarities occur. So if we take, for instance, the autumn full moon, and we see that in the American continent, there were people that also gave some symbolic importance to the same event in a different way, but because it was fitting on their rites and their rhythms. But it's really astonishing how we see the same things appearing in different parts of the globe. And in that sense, yes, it's surprising.
More questions? Well, then if there are no more questions, then let's move on to the next speaker. Thank you very much, Luís. Thank you very much, Fernando Pimenta,
Thank
and
you.
also Fabio Silva, who could not be here. Thank you very much. Okay, so our next speaker is Lana, who has written a chapter together with Natalie Uomini. Natalie is not here, but so Lana is with us, and she, are you ready? There she is. And would you like to test your presentation, or do you think we can go in one
Let's just try it.
Okay, let's try it. Here we go. So please meet Lana Ruck from Indianapolis University.
Hi, y'all. Okay, share screen. I want to share my PowerPoint. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Lana Ruck. Can you see my screen okay? Hopefully that's
We can, but can you enlarge it, please? There you go. Okay, we can.
Okay. So my name is Lana Ruck. I'm a PhD student at Indiana University in Bloomington. And along with my co-author, Natalie Uomini, we wrote a chapter called Artifact, Praxis, Tool, and Symbol for this edited volume. Thank you again for inviting us. I'm so excited this is finally coming out. It's been some time. So just an overview of the chapter. It's basically a review paper on the long-held view that language and technology co-evolved. Lots of relevant literature to cite for that, just because it is such a pervasive view across many different realms of literature. We argue that archaeological artifacts, particularly the case of preserved stone tools, that they serve as a relevant data set for studying the evolution of language. And I will go into detail on that later. I would recommend this reading, kind of going back to it and looking back at what we did. I would recommend this for like very ambitious senior undergraduate students or junior starting graduate students who are getting into the field of language evolution or language origins and kind of want to know from the archaeological perspective, as well as people from non-archaeology or non-anthropology areas of the field, to kind of learn a little bit of the basics of stone tools. What are the basic terminologies and things like that. That's what I would recommend this for. It pulls a lot of different literatures together, which is why these kinds of conferences and edited volumes and things like that are valuable, because we do find these similar trends across all these very different data sets and then have to come together and kind of make sense of all that together. And so our goal is to unite these decades of theory and kind of problematize some of them and unite them with these diverse empirical studies that are ongoing now and suggest pragmatic paths forward for continuing to narrow down whatever your specific question is, whether it's like the origins of language or what specific context language might have evolved in or anything. It really depends on your specific questions. So we open up by talking about symbolism and its links to the anthropological concept of modernity and what it means to be a modern human. Because in the anthropological literature, this is like a central debate that is, I would say, mostly settled on the side that recent origins for symbolic capacities are not, and I mean recent in the sense of like the last 50,000 years, versus there are these these theories of symbolic artifacts and evidence of symbolic thought is much, much older than the appearance of modern humans and much, much earlier than 50,000 years ago when we see really clear evidence of symbolic artifacts like representational art and figurines and things like that. The argument here, we go back to a really old, or well, not a really old paper, but we go back to a classic paper on this debate of why are we trying to find the oldest symbol and talk only about these like very narrow concepts of like who made the oldest symbol, where was it found, what might it be used for, and kind of shift away from these kind of basic questions, away from thinking of man as tool maker, man as like cognitively complex, man as linguistic, and then everything else, right? I have this picture of this quote from Louis Leakey when Jane Goodall first discovered chimps using tools, because we had such a scientific concept that these things were isomorphic, and modernity was a very recent thing. And now, you know, thinking about the talks that we have at this conference now and research going on with primate and non-human animal tool use and linguistic capacities and stuff, now our questions are very different, and they're more about what are the material contexts under which we can find concrete evidence of referential thought. And if we can find material evidence of this really ephemeral property, right? Referential thought and language are so ephemeral, but if you can find material analogs for them, or material analogs for the representational capacities that language relies upon, can you detect patterns in them? Can you tell when or where they percolated or things like that? So that's our first topic. We kind of take on the modernity debate and talk about how now we know that there's a long precedent of tool use, of symbolic, well, not symbolic, of tool use and other complicated, very complicated behaviors in other species. So that's the first thing we tackle. And then we talk about what are artifacts and tools, starting to get into what is a tool and who makes them, which is very debated. How do tools preserve archaeologically? And then how does this impact our power of inference? So for instance, there's a lot of debate in primate tool use literature about what constitutes a tool versus an aid. How complex does the level of planning have to be? How far does the individuals have to go to retrieve the material? Is it rare? Is it close? Or is it complicated? Things like that. But a lot of tools that animals use and make don't even preserve archaeologically. So from a perspective that way, like that part of the debate is for the experimental archaeologists, what counts as a tool for primates. But it is important. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. I apologize. What was I? Oh, okay. Oh, but primate tools, like we don't have a lot of evidence of perishable tool types. I'm so sorry. You know, wood and bone and plant materials and all of that, because they don't preserve archaeologically. So we have a long discussion in the paper about this concept of taphonomy, of how archaeological sites form and what you have to be aware of as an archaeologist when you're trying to study these sites. And that's something that I think language evolution researchers, all of us are studying a black box problem. We all have this like very difficult, unidentified space we're trying to get at, and we're etching away at it and etching away at it. And being very meticulous about how you use inference and how you use inferential thinking and connecting data to interpretation. That's why we all are, as scientists, very into this topic, because we all have research interests where you can make wrong interpretations. You can overinterpret something, underinterpret something, and you have to realize that there are many different factors that lead to what you're observing in the archaeological record in terms of preservation. So our argument is, not only is it convenient that stone tools are rocks and they preserve regularly and they show up a long time ago in the record, right? At 3 million years, stone tools appear, and starting at 2.5, they're regularly on the landscape. And so stone tools are valuable because they're abundant in terms of like sample size, they're abundant in terms of timeline, but also because they, and then the next part of things is that they're actually content-wise important. It's not just a convenient thing to study. It turns out stone tool making is a very, very important behavior. So the next topic that we review in the paper is praxis. After kind of giving a little bit of a primer on what archaeological tools mean, what the timeline is for what we're talking about, we start talking about what it's actually like to make a stone tool and why we consider stone tool making to be what we call a praxis. So I have a video here of an expert stone tool maker. He's been trying for decades training to make these tools. And he has a problem with the rock right there, that white ridge that he just flipped over, and he keeps looking at it. it's like a part of the rock that is not cooperating. The video is about to loop and play back over again. But I chose this clip because it presents exactly what stone tool making is like. It's a fine manual motor action. So it's just using your hands to bang rocks together, but there is so much extra cognitively complicated. And by the time you're making these types of tools, probably social and functional, like there are complicated things going on in the brain while these actions are happening. And so we defined praxis in the paper as an action which is semantically rich. So it's a physical action that is taken upon the world, which leaves a material trace, but it isn't just an action in and of itself, it has some form of meaning. That's how we're defining it. And like the previous speaker and lots of people that come to Protolang talk about all the time, one of the really important things about this is that there's a material scaffold, there's materiality to it, right? And that's what we're all trying to kind of study, or these interfaces between the action and the referential content. And so what's really important about, how long have I been talking? 10 minutes, and I have 10 left. Okay, we're gonna go a little slower. I'm having a little bit of trouble unpacking the praxis section because I like the way it's written so much that I didn't put good notes here. But this section that we talk about praxis and we talk about how difficult it is to make a stone tool, there's so much empirical evidence that by the time you're making Acheulean tools, which is the beginning of this short clip I'm showing you, that even modern humans cannot learn to do that kind of tool making without some kind of instruction. And so what we do in our lab, what I do with my research is I try to understand the neural basis of stone tool manufacture. I try to understand what's going on in the brain while these people are using and making these stone tools. And that's why it's also really important. Stone tools are readily available and they're really complicated, manually complex things to make. But it turns out that experimental evidence from recent decades shows that stone tool making and language use similar brain areas. So what I do in my lab is I take different humans with different levels of expertise at stone tool making, and I take different types of technology types, and I do a little bit of Stone Age neuroscience. I don't know where my slides aren't clicking through. There you go. Now they're not. Okay. So I do some Stone Age neuroscience. And what we do is, it depends. I'm not going to go into detail. We either train or don't train people. We put experts or novices in the scanner, and then we show them stimuli, videos of experts making stone tools, and ask our participants various questions about the stimuli. In this case, we didn't ask participants questions at all. We were just asking them to imagine doing the actions that they were seeing being done. And we can get a naturalistic time course of what brain areas are involved in that. And it turns out that over different studies with different experimental designs, we keep finding overlaps in brain areas. And as this is an audience that, evolution doesn't work from nothing, which is why there's the decades of theory and all of that anyways. We're just tacking on more and more empirical evidence to show that tool making is a really important behavior, and that it has something to do with this really, one of a kind system that happened over evolution where we became referential thinkers and we were able to disassociate in time and space. And we had to have, at the beginning, we had to have material analogs for that. And stone tools are a really good example of that, because as you become a better stone tool maker, the tools themselves mean more to you. So there's a lot of discussion of these objects, hand axes, this one that I'm showing here and one that I'm showing right here, as icons, as symbols themselves. And there's debate. Sometimes hand axes are intentionally shaped to look like other objects. Sometimes They are shaped in ways that highlight certain things like natural fossil inclusions, and not to get into this specific object versus that specific object versus this one and that one, these are symbolic, and to think more about trends again. It doesn't matter so much the more and more cases you find of a symbolic artifact, more that matters that we know by this time there are lots of complicated behaviors happening that really suggest some type of referential like thought is present. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to end up with these kinds of artifacts. And so I have this chart over here just to mention that in our research, we find really early simple stone tools can be easily taught. They're not cognitively complex, but right around this invention of the Acheulean at 2.5 million years ago, things get really, the tool manufacture gets complicated, and that's when brain sizes start increasing. Lots of niche changes are happening in our species. There's a lot of things happening at that time period. And so me and my colleague, based on all of this literature, argue that we see at least some kind of proto-language form by the time of the late Acheulean. We see that there's evidence of at least very complex social learning and teaching going on, whether that's in a full linguistic form versus something else, gestural mixed, any kind of, we're not gonna be able to go back in time and say details about that. But narrowing down that context of when and how and what kinds of behaviors might have led to these amazing features of our species is kind of, yeah. Am I up for time? I have 5 minutes.
You can have 5 minutes.
Okay, yeah, this is my last slide. And I really was coming in here from the archaeological perspective. That's what I wanted to take in this talk, because we have such limited sample sizes of actual human ancestors. But once stone tools entered the game and preservation is not that much of an issue because they're already rocks, your sample size, again, for like what you could potentially study, like what material analogs do you have available to you to try and look for evidence of symbolic capacity? Your sample size is giant. The flip side of that, though, is then it becomes difficult to narrow down, well, what about the stone tools should I be looking at that tell me this is evidence of a praxis action, or this is evidence of something that was symbolically mediated? And I think that's where the field is currently at. We're trying to figure out what aspects of stone tools can we look at and which ones can be explained by lower level features, which ones are not really relevant to the idea of symbolic thought, which ones are not, maybe not the most relevant for a language evolution discussion. But the work is really, really slow because, again, archaeology is like trying to reconstruct an unconstructable thing from all these little tangential clues. And with something as complicated as language evolution, you don't want to misinterpret things. So you have to be very, very careful in your inferences and how you use that inferential space. And so again, just one more plug for experimental archaeology and kind of seeing, well, how does this process of stone toolmaking happen in modern analogs today? How does toolmaking work in other non-human species? Also very, very important. What kind of material analogs does that process leave, right? And do any of those material analogs give evidence for what the behavior was, and do they preserve? These are kinds of the topics we're discussing in the paper. Okay, and I think that's good for that. Thanks for listening, y'all.
Thank you very much, Lana. Questions? If you have questions, please put it in the chat or raise your virtual hand. JT has a question.
Thank you. Thanks, Lana. That was great. I look forward to reading the chapter. I saw that there was the quote with, now we have to redefine the word tool because other primates probably have tools. Last year I published in Encyclopedia of Creativity an article suggesting what if we widen the definition of tool to anything that solves a problem, whether it's an idea, process, or product. I saw on the brain scan you had tool-only areas marked and then language-only areas marked. On this wider view, I'm proposing it would be language would be a tool for solving a communication problem. But is that tool-making section of the brain, is that purely for actions of making stone tools and those sorts of physical world fine motor activities? Is that what that refers to?
Yeah, I like that conceptualization. I often like many conceptualizations of symbol and language and all that stuff. That was images for tool use studies in general, so not stone tools specifically. And that is one issue with this field is, you know, there are like 7 people in the world that do what I do. But there are tons of psychologists who are studying tool use and tools in that context. So that's where most of that MRI literature came from, most of those brain scan stuff. But the stone tool literature, there's still some questions about laterality of activation for stone tool making. Stone tool making seems to be right lateralized in the brain, whereas language is left lateralized. And that's my specific thing and my co-author, Natalie Uomini, we actually specifically focus in laterality as another marker for how you kind of get at. So one of my tangibles is we know handedness relates to laterality. We know handedness relates to tool making. We know handedness could potentially be detected in stone tools. Could we at least track laterality? Just kind of trying to get any way you can at these topics. And then everyone's doing the same thing and you all got to read everybody else and be like, wow, I've never thought of it from that angle, but it matches or doesn't match or sort of matches. And that's why I really love this field. It's so fun.
Thank you. Great. Great talk.
More questions? Ian Watts, you are muted.
Yeah, it's just, I'm wondering whether you could be, I've always been a bit skeptical about how stone tools and cultural evolution can actually begin to address questions of symbolic culture. And I mean, you flagged it, but didn't go into it about hand axes. I mean, I can readily see how they could serve an indexical purpose, but I'm still sort of struggling to see how that might relate to symbolism or shared fantasies.
Yeah, that's a great like comment question, because whether or not hand axes have their iconic shape and their stereotyped everything about their manufacture, whether they have that for a higher level reason, or for instance, is it just a byproduct of how you manufacture a tool? Like, what if this this teardrop shape, this iconic thing about hand axes, is just how a tool would end up if you were trying to make it that way anyways? And there's I mean, there are 30 or 40 papers debating that alone, about whether hand axes are reflect anything like above and beyond just a basic standardization of form. I would say a couple things on that. and this, my advisor always says this, he always says to anybody who is skeptical of hand axes and things about them, like, try to make one. Try to make one. That's what he tells people. Because the process of making the hand axe itself is part of what we kind of argue in the paper. The process of making it itself probably required some form of very complicated thought that might have required linguistic instruction. That's what the empirical evidence in modern humans suggests right now, although, you know, there are plenty of problems with using modern human analogs and thinking about historic ancestors. So, I mean, I don't know, so many problems, so many questions to answer. I would recommend looking at some of the work of Thomas Wynne on hand axes. He has this really fantastic paper about hand axes that are shaped like horse heads. And what else? I don't know. I think that's satisfactory for that one for now.
I think it's satisfactory for all of us, Lana. Thank you very much.
I'm so much better in writing than talking, guys. I'm not
I
good
think you're doing a great job. I think that Chris also had a question. Christina, you raised your hand?
Can you hear me now? Yes.
Yes.
Lana, thank you very much for your talk, and nice the way, they were great. And yeah, this is just to take up this issue, right? And it is interesting and important, you know, the extent to which we can draw an inferential line from a constructive praxis to a communicative praxis, and there seem to be two ways that people have gone about this. One is to look at the levels of complexity, perhaps embedded actions and so forth, which is implicated in the constructive praxis, and then try to kind of do an argument by analogy to the kind of something like, you know, the possibility that this implicates recursive capacities in cognition, which would be relevant to language. But another way of looking at this is to look at it more functionally and in a kind of situated way, which is the one that you're kind of taking, which is, I suppose, is something to do with the notion that actually the learning of this particular praxis is impossible without some kind of communicative context. Which probably involves a form of teaching. And I think that's kind of where you're taking it. But there's an issue to do with that as well, which is that if we look at contemporary cultures around the world, there are very many different modalities of teaching, which may involve demonstration and emulation, or may involve actually kind of, you know, explanatory linguistic utterances. And I just wondered if you had anything to say about that.
Yeah, I have tons to say about it, but not enough time. So I would say, like, for me, the fact that there are nested hierarchies of planned action in stone tool making, you know, that's how you kind of open the door on getting people who don't think about stone tools to think about them. And kind of going that, you know, if this wasn't a big overarching theory paper, I could go into the details of what are the steps and what are the algorithms and all that. But getting to the part of teaching and how that relates to it adds another, you know, there's another little tack to add of, like, this is another thing that checks a box or whatever you want to say. Wow, what was I going to say about that? Teaching, different types of teaching. Oh, one of the things that I didn't mention in the talk, but is in the paper, I find the developmental literature for language learning fascinating in that sense too, right? Because you look at what object manipulation does and scaffolding of objects and first word learning. And it's like, you need a referent at the same time as the thing is said, like, well, and this is how children learn the words. And now we have just fine-grained data about that. And stone tool making is like that. You have the object there, you're explaining it, you know, and yeah, on these different timescales. For me, it's like matching a developmental timescale and saying you go from these material scaffolds to these kind of, you know, then you explore the space of, you know, displacement in time or space, and then you're 17 metaphors and we're all writing dissertations, right? The scale is crazy in an individual lifetime, but it follows the same basic premise as probably would happen on the evolutionary scale, right? Where it's piecemeal and incremental and messy and complicated and yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Lana. Thank you very much. And so now we are supposed to have a talk by April Noel, but I got an email from her this morning, which was her evening because she's in Canada in Victoria, that she had problems with, she was going to make a video and she had problems with the video, with the recording. And so I don't have a video to show. And then the next speaker is Elizabeth Cully, who is also on that same side of America. And she has written a paper together with Ian Davidson, who is in Australia. And in Australia, it's night now. But so Elizabeth was supposed to give the presentation, but then we didn't hear back from her. So we at this moment still don't know whether she will join us here today or not, because we have not been able to reach her. But so what I suggest now is that we just continue, Chris and I, to give you a short presentation of the different parts that we have. And then we can see if Elizabeth makes it or not. And otherwise, this session ends a bit sooner. And then we can also have a discussion with the authors also that are here in the audience, perhaps a final discussion about the things said. So let me share my screen. Yeah, so for the people that missed this morning's session, so we are having a follow-up handbook on the Handbook of Human Symbolic Evolution, of which the first edition came out in the early 90s, where it was edited by Andrew Luck and Charles Peters. And then Andy has invited me and Chris Sinha, or he has invited Chris Sinha, and then both of them invited me to be part of this follow-up handbook of human symbolic evolution. And so the handbook has 6 parts. This is the almost final arrangement that we have for the handbook. And so these 6 parts each study different aspects of human symbolism. So in the first part, we look into epistemological considerations, the second one, psychological, the third one, anthropological, the fourth one, ethological, and the fifth one, linguistic considerations of how to study human symbolic evolution. And then in the last part, we have technological considerations. And so let's go over these parts quickly. I just want to point out that the handbook is already online. This is the link, and if you are watching this video on the YouTube channel, then this link will be posted into the comment section of the YouTube video. And so the first part is about how do you study symbolism. And so here we have bundled several articles that look into the epistemology, the methodology, the theory formation that is going on into how we study human symbolic evolution. And so this part opens with a double chapter written by me, one on the evolution of the biological sciences and one on the evolution of the symbolic sciences. And so everybody knows that these days that there is a lot of turmoil going on within the evolutionary sciences, where it has more or less gained more and more consensus that the neo-Darwinian paradigm, although a very important paradigm, is not sufficient to explain all of evolution. That also includes all of human evolution. And so a lot of people are looking into how this modern synthesis that is by now 100 years old can be extended. Also, how it can be extended towards sociocultural evolution, towards linguistic and cognitive evolution. And so in these 2 chapters, first I look into these debates within biology. I look into the different schools that there are. And then in the second chapter, I look into how these different schools are being implemented into the evolution of the symbolic sciences. And there I give an overview of the different fields that there exist, going from evolutionary psychology to sociobiology to for cognitive theory, etc. And then the following chapter is written by Ian Tattersall, who gives a timeline of the acquisition of symbolic cognition in the human lineage. So of course, a handbook on human symbolic evolution has to have a timeline and a scenario of the different hominids and how they evolved and where they can be situated, where the fossil finds are. And so Ian wrote that chapter. And then that is followed by Anna Maschkik, who is a student of Francesco Derico, who will also write a preface to the handbook. He's actually writing it at the moment. And so Anna, she has written a chapter on behavioral modernity, evolutionary synergies, and the symbolic species. And so, as you know, in archaeology, there is an ongoing debate on the difference between anatomically modern humans and behavioral modernity, and there the question is, can we find aspects of modern behavior in species that are not anatomically modern, and not only within the human lineage, but also whether Neanderthals or Homo floresiensis or other Homo species developed symbolic behavior that can be considered modern. And so she writes about that. And then the following chapter is written by Michael Arbib, who writes about the aboutness of language and the evolution of the construction-ready brain. So he brings in neurology, cognitive psychology, and he looks into the question of whether there is some kind of construction-ready brain. It's a theory that is very much his own. And so he writes on his specific theory. And then the last chapter of the first part is written by Antonio Benetiz Buraco and Anne de Dieu, who write about the evolution of language and speech, what we know from genetics. And so it is in general very difficult to find genes that are connected with human symbolic evolution, with cultural evolution, linguistic evolution, but with certain kinds of language pathologies. There have been correlations, and with certain psychological pathologies, there have been correlations with genes, and so they look into that. So that's the first part. And then the second part is about symbolic pathways, and that is about psychological considerations. And so here we've bundled all the chapters that are on psychology, and psychology in the broadest sense. So we have people working on cognitive psychology, for cognitive theory, evolutionary psychology, also some behavioral ecology. And so the first chapter there is written by Francisco Suman, who actually has a background in philosophy of science, philosophy of biology, and he writes about culturally driven plasticity. So phenotypic plasticity is the plasticity that is demonstrated by the genotype to demonstrate different phenotypes depending upon the environment. And Sinha, then he writes about niche construction, and niche construction is basically the possibility to develop by learning, and so to go against the genotype and to construct your own environment. And so Sinha there, he writes about niche construction. But of course, Chris, perhaps you want to introduce your chapter yourself. Of course, perhaps you want to say a couple of words.
Yeah, I'm just putting my live picture back there.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I can say really just a couple of sentences that you know, I'm not sure that I would characterize this as a purely psychological piece, because it's in fact it's about the biocultural evolution in a truly conciliant, to use the word that Andy used, fashion, and it's actually attempting to look at the way in which both material niches and symbolic niches are co-constructed, and I take the notion that we owe to the Estonian Russian philosopher Yuri Lotman of the semiosphere, and I try to look at the way in which what I call the technosphere of constructed praxis is kind of interrelated with the semiosphere in the construction of the human niche. So it is about issues that we've talked about this morning: artifactuality, symbolization, and the interface between biology and culture. And indeed, it is all within, if you like, a psychological or cognitive context. I think that's enough.
Thank you very much, Chris. And then the next chapter is by Peter Gardenfors and Anders Hoogberg, and they talk about intentional teaching. And in fact, Peter has recently given a presentation for the AppEEL webinar series, so you can also find him on the AppEEL webinars on the YouTube channel and look into his presentation. And so here they look into the importance of intentional teaching and how that shapes development, how that underlies niche construction. Because of course, as Chris says, niche construction is much more than just a cognitive phenomenon. It is something that extends towards the environment, that changes the environment. And so in that regard, this is something that is more and more being grouped within an overall kind of developmental evo-eco approach within evolutionary biology. And then the next chapter is by Nick Enfield and Jack Sidnell. And so Nick, we heard this morning, he talks about intersubjectivity. So intentionality, how there can be some kind of mutual understanding, how that underlies group formation, which is of course very important for human societies. And then the next chapter is Camilla Power, Ian Watts, and Chris Knight. We heard them this morning as well. With their symbolic revolution model and the sexual conflict model. I think it's also a very important chapter because we know that sex plays a very important role that is much more than just reproduction within primate societies in general. And of course, this is a very daring theory and they provide one scenario on how it is possible that there can be some kind of truce between the sexes, between the battle of the sexes. If you look at chimpanzee society, it is really so that males can demonstrate an enormous cruelty towards women. And then bonobos, for example, there you have female coalitions where the female coalitions actually are able to dominate over the male ones. And then the question, of course, is also how did that evolve within the human lineage and also within other hominins? Like, how do we reach a state where there is something like parental investment, for example? How do we reach that? But of course, there's also a lot of cruelty still within human societies. If you think about circumcisions and if you think about stoning when there is adultery and all of that, that can also still be very cruel. So this is a very important paper. And then another paper is by Maria Boteiro about parenting. That's also something that associates with that. So in relation to the sexual revolutions that we have, how do we parent and how does that differ from other primates? So that's the second part. And then the third part looks into anthropological considerations. So here we look into the life ways that there are the different ways of being symbolic and how that then translates into cultural action and into group living. And so here the chapter is opened by Elizabeth Cully and Ian Davidson, where they have taken on the daunting task to find a general definition for art that is equally applicable to, for example, a painting of Van Gogh and, for example, a tali stick that we find from within the Paleolithic that is used to make engravings and that perhaps was the basis of a notational system. So I don't know if Elizabeth will make it here today, but in any case, it's a very interesting chapter. And then the next one is Antonis Iliopoulos and Lambros Malafouris. We heard Antonis this morning, where they implement a kind of 4E cognition theory into archaeological research. And so the question then becomes, what is the lived experience of the tool? How can you find meaning? How can it be a form of an extension of cognition? How can tools do that? And also what kind of praxis and relationship do you engage with material culture, that is something that is also applicable not only in ancient times, but also in the present. For example, what kind of relations do we maintain with the material possessions that we have? It's a very interesting paper. And then the next one, Ola, I'm sorry, I somehow, yeah. Okay, so then the next one is April Noel and Amanda Cook. So April was supposed to be here today. And she has written a very interesting paper about the different ways there are of culturing the body. And with that, she means, you know, humans and have made so many kinds of other adornments and body modifications, tattooing, scarring. You know, there are so many kinds of body modifications that are out there that can be cultural, that can be symbolic, and so what kinds are out there, and when do we find that evidence for that within the archaeological record? Rupert Till, he writes about the evolution of music, and he does that in a very broad sense from the beginning of the first flutes that are found within the archaeological record until the musical instruments that are made by the ancient Greeks. And then another chapter is the one by Fabio Silva and Luís Tirapicos and Fernando Pimenta on archaeoastronomy, the one that Luís just presented at the beginning of this session. I think it's a very important paper because I think like the time is ripe now to recognize that these stone monuments, these circles, these horseshoe shapes, that there is most definitely a connection there with the sky, that there was some kind of early astronomy going on, and that it is not to be underestimated. So, you know, there was there was science at the beginning of the human lineage in many ways, before religion, before philosophy, perhaps even there was already like calculations going on of what is happening in the stars. And then Rosalind Frank, she effectively talks about the origin of number sense and numericity in that regard. So then the fourth part is about ethological considerations. And so here ethology is broadly conceived because we have included animal studies, but also primatological studies. And we even have a paper that links viruses to humans. So today, and this is something especially still mostly going on within biology, we see that social biological theories, for example, are in the lift again when people study bacterial communities or viral communities, because people are seeing more and more that there is some kind of a social interaction between bacteria. And so here you have organisms with no brain, with no neural connections, with no vision, no sense of awareness in any way that a human being has, of being a member of the group, but there is some kind of social behavior. Also, bacteria, for example, can make tools, like, you know, they can make kind of weapons. They can, antibiotics, for example, is a form of a weapon to protect themselves when they encounter other bacteria. So in that regard, it is in the lift. And I think that is something like, if Andy was talking about a third handbook, that could be something for a third handbook. The question to go beyond, not only to go to primates and from primates to compare those to animals, but to look for cognition in plants, to look for cognition in bacteria, in viruses, etc. And so that would be something for a third handbook. And also, if there are people interested in working on that, I would be interested in working on that with you. But so the first chapter here is written by Günter Witzani, and he looks into how viruses made us human. And the short story is that it is now somewhat proven that our ancestors must have gotten some viral infection, which has caused them to lose their sense of smell. And the sense of smell for many animals and for many primates, it's what enables social bonding. And because we don't have that sense of smell, it might have been an incentive to find different ways of being together and to find different ways to recognize each other as part of the same group. So that's the short version of that paper. Then Ulrike Griebel and Kimbro Oller, they talk about animal signals and communication and symbolism. So what kind of animal signals are out there, alarm calls, etc. And how can we study their communicative meaning? And they do that mostly from within a neo-Darwinian perspective. And then Augusta Gaspar, she talks about the relation between emotions and expressions. As we know, Darwin wrote a very important book on the relation between emotions and expressions. And he thought that such was the outcome of evolution by means of natural selection, and so that it was somehow instinctive and inborn. But what Augusta shows is that a lot of the association that there is between emotions and expressions is really something that is culturally learned. So there is a biological component to it, but there's also a lot of learning there going on. And then David Levens and Kim Bart, they write about primate cognition in captivity. Why in captivity? Well, because we were supposed to also have a chapter on primate cognition in the wild, but we didn't find nobody brave enough to do it. But we're very happy with the chapter by David Levens and Kim Bart on primate cognition in captivity. And then Heidi Lin, she wrote on animal language studies, so the famous experiments with Yorkish and with American Sign Language. And so Heidi wrote about that. And then I think with the most cheeky title that I think was introduced by Andy, Kanzi or can't he? So Kanzi is a famous bonobo that has been taught this pictorial language, Yorkish. And the question is, can he or can he not Kanzi use language? And then the chapter is ended by Lana Ruck and Natalie Uomini, and so we just heard Lana about her very important work. And then the fifth part is about the transition from proto-language to language. So this is really linguistics. And so the part is going to open with a chapter by Francesco Ferretti, who is a philosopher, and he writes a very important chapter on the narrative origins of language. So he looks into the functionality of language, and there he says that language by far is the biggest instrument for narration, for storytelling. And so he looks into how that might have evolved. And then Sławomir Łakiewicz and Przemysław Zikwizinski, the founders of Protolang, they talk about pantomimic conceptions of language origins. So they look into how a proto-language might have been pantomimic. And in that regard, also, it relates to the question of how that pantomime can be a form of storytelling. And in that regard, both Francisco and Sławomir and Przemek have also talks online on the AppEEL YouTube channel, so please check it out. And then I'm gonna drink. Okay, then we have Tanja Kuteva and Bernd Hein, with I think what is the most linguistic chapter of the entire handbook. And there they write on the process of grammaticalization and on the difference between analytical and holistic proto-language. And then Susan Golden Meadow, she talks about gestures and her very important work on sign languages. And then Ulf Liskowski and Johanna Rutter, they talk about pointing. And then Gert Carling, she talks about, with her co-authors, Shundra Schathart and Eric Round, she talks about reconstructing the origins of language families and variation. So here we make a jump, then once all these languages are there, once you have all this enormous amount of language variation, then how do you study that language variation? Classically, that has been studied from within historical linguistics. Historical linguistics today is more and more merging and hybridizing with evolutionary biology. There's always been this connection in many ways, but so they are hybridizing tools and methodologies and techniques. And so that results into tree networks and into tree typologies and into network typologies to study language variation and language diversity. And so she contributes a very important paper on that. And then the final part is about technological considerations, and that is on the question of how we are currently expanding symbolism. And as I said this morning, I think the sixth part is the part that differs the most from the previous handbook, because here we have also gone futuristic. So in many ways, if you look into the study of human symbolic evolution, you look at the past. We look into how we compare to chimpanzees, how we compare to how chimpanzees compare to animals, how we then compare to animals. So we look into the past. But that takes away the fact and the recognition also that we are an ongoing evolving species. So we are constantly evolving. And we are looking then here in this part into how we have been evolving more in the current and how we will be evolving in the future. And so here we open with a chapter on money. Todd Oakley there has contributed a very important paper on the origin of money and its role in modernity, because I think money is really something that has been a defining feature for many aspects of modern society. It has helped to define economy. Economy then helps to define politics. Politics helps to define trade, etc. So it is something that really distinguishes us also. I think, like, you know, you can have grooming already. That is something that is present in primates, and so there is some kind of calculation system there going on, tit for tat. If you groom me, I will share my food with you. But to do that on an even more symbolic level, to do that with something like money and trade, that is really something that is very typical of us humans. And so Todd Oakley writes about that. Then Prem Podar, she writes about force fields of the modern, the symbolic contestation of power. And power there also, you know, how is power conceptualized within human communities, and what does that lead to? Then Rukmini Baya Nair, she writes about archaeo-writing, narrative, embodiment, emotion, and empathy. And then Alex de Voogd, he writes on the evolution of writing systems. And so here also what I really like very much about his paper is that he demonstrates that writing systems today are being invented out of the blue, so without any continuity. They are de novo invented in societies up until today. So here also you cannot, that's also something that Chris was saying in the beginning, that he's writing about in the introduction, like you cannot always think about human evolution as a staging system. Today, while there are people going on the internet, there are people still inventing the script, and that doesn't mean that these groups of people are stuck in time or something. It just shows that we don't know how to understand evolution. And so then the challenge is, like, how do you understand something, like, you know, if you have some kind of, you go from writing to the internet, for example, if you want to see that as a sequence, then how also do you explain de novo appearances of writing systems? And then Sverker Johansson and Jelava Lindberg, they talk about cyberculture. So with the introduction of the World Wide Web, we have seen new ways of being symbolic, and one of them is cybercultures. And in that regard, Francis Heiligen, and he has the biggest title of all of them, has written a chapter, a very important one, on transcending the rational symbol system, how information and communication technology integrates science, art, philosophy, and spirituality into a global brain. And so this is the question of where are we evolving to with this World Wide Web, with this online kind of living, with these cybercultures that we are evolving. And in that regard, you know, there is a lot of mind uploading going on already on the internet, a lot of mind downloading. So, you know, we go to Wikipedia and we read the mind of the global community. And in that regard, the internet is becoming some kind of external storage system. And it is also becoming what many people have started to call, including Francis Heiligen, the global brain. And so then the question is, what does this global brain do? Is there some kind of singularity? And then, of course, when you talk about these things and mind uploading, downloading, you also end up with the question of transhumanism and the technosciences. And that is also how the part ends with the chapter of Natasha Vita Moore. So that is the outline of the handbook. And in that regard, I want to thank again the authors and also the people from Oxford, which are Martin, Charlotte, Janine, Afrose, and Victoria. And so let me stop sharing. And then I suggest that we have a discussion, and that we start, for example, with Chris, that I'm sure that he wants to say something.
Thank you, Natalie. As a matter of fact, I would rather kind of get some feedback from the other people in the seminar to see, you know, if you have any comments about the way in which we have, you know, evolved, as it were, the organization of this volume, I'd be quite grateful, and I'm sure Natalie and Andy too, to hear them. We maybe the only thing that I would say is that, well, okay, two things. One is that that we do not pretend that we have actually produced a completely comprehensive and representative, you know, sample of work in this massive field of human symbolic evolution. Indeed, you know, we have found it sometimes difficult to actually get people to address specific topics, and we are aware of particular hiatuses, you know, and gaps in our coverage. I mean, so what we do about this, I don't know. I mean, there is an issue about, you know, where we go with the online handbook in the future. But we do know that there are some topics that we would have liked to have covered, and we did not succeed in getting authors. The second thing is that this is a little bit more complicated, perhaps, and that is that on the one hand, we do not, you know, we do not kind of, we never tried to impose a sort of party line, all right? On, you know, we're not trying to say that this is the theory. We are, you know, the whole field is much too diverse for us to, you know, attempt a sort of totalizing overview of that kind. And, you know, it is the authors who are responsible for their own content. And there may be differences of emphasis and even disagreement. And yet, it has been actually very interesting to see how, in a way, if we compare this edition with the 1996 handbook, there is most definitely a kind of feeling of a new, let's not call it a consensus, but some kind of a new vibe and a new way in human symbolic evolution. And we can kind of leave it up to the reader to make their own kind of designation of what that is. So yeah, those would be my main points. But for now, the most important thing is to, you know, ask you for your comments.
Thank you very much, Chris. So comments, questions? JT.
Yes, well done, Chris, Andy, and Natalie. It looks very good. I just noticed on the website, which I've just posted into the chat there, when Natalie, when you went through those part headings, that all made perfect sense. I noticed on the web page there, it doesn't seem to be organized by those parts currently. I don't know why. It just made so much sense when you divided it into those 6 sections. But when I'm looking at that page now, is that the same that you have when you click that link?
Yes, so that is very important to say. Thank you for raising that issue, and it's very important to say so that website is under construction, and it is not up to date, and it is not complete, because there are several chapters in the pipeline, including mine, that are waiting to be proved. And the cover is ready, but it is waiting to go online. And so they've been experiencing some technical difficulties. But so, you know, it's a matter of time, and then it will be updated, yes. But it is at this moment not in sync. No, it's not.
Thank you. I had one other question. This is more a detail, and I should just read the chapter. In the chapter where the authors define art, I wonder, did they refer to Dennis Dutton's The Art Instinct? Because I noticed he always had a good list of 12 cluster criteria for art. And I only just realized you only need one of the 12 to be able to call something art. And I always thought you needed all 12 of them, but anyway, I should just read the chapter, I guess.
I think Elizabeth and Ian have written a very decolonialized chapter of what art is, and a de-Europeanized idea of what art is. And I am not an art scholar. I cannot reproduce it out of my mind, but I think it's an amazing chapter. In fact, I see that Elizabeth is not coming. I hope she is well, because we haven't heard from her. It is very because Ian said Elizabeth will do it, and then we haven't heard from her. So I do hope that she is well. We all hope that she is well. But yes. More questions, comments, ideas? Chris, you want to say something?
No.
Mm.
No, I don't.
Okay, so then on that note, I suggest that we call it a day. I want to thank everybody very kindly for participating. I want to thank the speakers. I want to thank the audience. I want to thank Protolang for hosting our event. And I want to thank Chris and Andy for the handbook, for the opportunity, for everything. Chris, you want to say something else?
Well, you know, you'll hear from us again, because as Natalie said, you know, this project is still very much in progress, and yeah, I mean, keep an eye on the website, because new content is actually going up. It takes a while. I mean, and some of the delay in producing this handbook is down to us, the editors, you know, because we all have a lot of work to do, which is not all of which is to do with this handbook. But it is also the case that the you know, the technicalities of production by Oxford University Press have been quite complex, and so this has imposed some delays on us as well. But so maybe the last thing I would like to say is that nonetheless, I think I speak for all of us in saying that we're really glad that we went with OUP, who do actually produce an amazing product and have, you know, given us a fantastic amount of support along the way. And we are, I mean, this is a repetition of what Natalie said, but we're really grateful for the team, to the team at OUP for the support they've given to us. So that's,
yeah, we really are. And they're also like, this is a process that has taken many years, many years. On average, when I do a special issue, it's like 2 years, and this has gone significantly beyond. But we are talking about 40 chapters. We are talking about an enormous amount of people that we bring together. And yeah, sometimes then authors have been late, and then what you do, you give the time, of course, because the end product otherwise has gaps. So, you know, and then we have also taken our time, but, you know, it is it's going to be a nice product. And so we are actually finalizing, and then things will go online, and then the hard print will be there next September, is what I heard. Okay, so thank you very much,
bye,
everybody.
everybody.